The first thing that struck interrogator savant Kalen was the silence. It was a thick, pressurized silence, broken only by the hum of the transport's engines and the rhythmic, metallic breathing of the Skitarius guard seated across from him. It was the silence of the void, the silence of a tomb, and for a psyker of his sensitivity it was a lie. Beneath the audible nothingness, a pressure was building. A psychic static, faint at first, like the roar of a distant ocean heard in a seashell. But as the transport drew closer to the research station Oubliette, the roar grew. It wasn't a sound, but a sensation, a weight on the soul, a cold nausea in the pit of his mind, the shadow in the warp. They had told him about it, but description was meaningless. You had to feel it to understand. It was the feeling of being watched by something too vast to comprehend. The transport docked with a shuddering clang that echoed through Kalen's bones. The door hissed open, revealing a corridor of gleaming, sterile adamantium and flickering lumen strips. The air was cold and smelled of ozone, counterseptic, and something else. Something faintly organic, like spoiled meat and chitin. Magos biologist Vorlox was there to meet him. The tech priest was a nightmare of flesh and machine, his lower body a multi-legged mechanical walker, one of his arms replaced by a humming bone saw, the other by a cluster of syringed mechadendrites. His human face was a pale, waxy mask, one eye replaced by a glowing red optic, the other still disturbingly human, and burning with a frightening intensity. Interrogator savant. Vorlox's voice was a dry, binary-laced rasp. Your compliance is noted. Your service here will be recorded in the annals of the Omnissiah's great work. I am a prisoner, Magos, Kalen said, his own voice sounding frail and human in the cavernous space. Let us not dress it up as service. Vorlox's human eye twitched. A perspective. You possess a tool. We require its use. The distinction between prisoner and servant is a semantic illusion. In the face of extinction, he turned, his mechanical legs clattering on the deck as he led Kalen deeper into the station. They passed through multiple layers of security, bulkheads of foot-thick plasteel, energy fields that made Kalen's teeth ache, and chambers lined with psi-dampening, hexagrammic wards that felt like smothering pillows on his mind. A welcome relief from the growing static outside. The subject is housed in the primary containment lab, Vorlox explained, his mechadendrites twitching with excitement. We have designated it Subject Omega, a hive tyrant, captured during the cleansing of Griffon IV, a remarkable specimen. Its synaptic node remains disconcertingly active. Kalen felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. A hive tyrant. Not some lesser gaunt, but a commander of the swarm. A conduit to the very intelligence they sought to understand. They reached a massive observation gallery overlooking the containment lab. The wall was a single sheet of armored crystal flecks, so thick it distorted the view beyond. But the view was clear enough to freeze the blood in Kalen's veins. Subject Omega hung in a web of glowing energy fields and cruel adamantium clamps. It was immense, a masterpiece of biological horror. Its scythe-like talons were each longer than Kalen was tall. Its carapace was a tapestry of deep purple and bloody red, scarred where Vorlox's tools had cut into it. Wires and probes were sunk deep into its flesh, monitoring the life that should not be. Its head, with a crest of bone and those dagger-like teeth, was held rigidly in place, but its eyes were open. They were black, multifaceted, and they seemed to drink the light from the room. And as Kalen stepped up to the crystal flecks, those eyes, with an intelligence that was ancient. Cold and utterly alien, swiveled and locked onto him. The psychic static, the shadow, didn't just intensify. It focused. It was no longer a distant roar. It was a voice, a single silent word made of hunger and data and purpose, drilled directly into Kalen's soul. It was a greeting. Kalen stumbled back, his hand flying to his temple as a spike of pain lanced behind his eyes. He tasted blood on his lips. Vorlox watched him, his red optic lens whirring as it focused. Fascinating. It has never reacted that way to any of my staff. He turned his burning gaze from Kalen to the monster in the cage. The link is already forming. The protocol begins in 6 hours. Prepare yourself, interrogator savant. You are about to touch the mind of God. Kalen could only stare, horrified, at the living God in the cage, which stared back, knowing him already. 6 hours was not a preparation. It was a countdown to an execution. Kalen sat in the sterile white cell they had given him, his head throbbing in time with the silent, psychic pulse emanating from the containment lab. He could feel it even through the wards, a slow, immense heartbeat that was not his own. The shadow in the warp was no longer an external pressure. It had become a drumbeat inside his skull, a rhythm of ancient predatory intent. He tried to meditate, to raise the psychic shields that had protected him his whole life from the random echoes of the past and the whispers of the Empyrean. But here they were useless. The hive mind's presence wasn't an attack to be blocked. It was an environment. It was the very air he psychically breathed. To shield against it would be to suffocate. When the cell door hissed open to reveal Magos Vorlox and his Skitarii escort, Kalen felt a perverse sense of relief. The waiting was over. The apparatus is prepared, Vorlox stated, his mechadendrites writhing like eager snakes. Your vital signs will be monitored. Do not resist the process. Resistance increases synaptic feedback and risks cerebral liquefaction. Cerebral liquefaction, Kalen repeated flatly. You could have just said death. Death is a cessation of data, Vorlox corrected, turning to lead the way. Liquefaction is a corruption of it. The distinction is critical. They entered a chamber adjacent to the main lab, a circular room dominated by a heavy, throne-like chair forged of black iron and writhing with cables. Wires snaked from it to banks of humming cogitators, where servitors sat motionless, their faces blank, interfaces plugged directly into their spines. The air hummed with suppressed power. Most terrifying of all, one entire wall of this chamber was the crystal flex window into Subject Omega's prison. The tyrant was visible in profile, a titanic statue of living weaponry, its chest slowly rising and falling. Kalen could feel its consciousness from here, a silent, dark star whose gravity was pulling at his mind. Assume the position, Vorlox commanded, gesturing to the chair. The chair was cold against his back. Metal restraints clamped over his wrists and ankles with finality. A crown of needles was lowered onto his head. He felt the sharp, cold prick as they breached his scalp, seeking direct contact with his brain. This is the psionic relay, Vorlox explained, his human eye wide with fanatical zeal. It will amplify your innate talent, forcing a bridge between your telepathic centers and the subject's synaptic node. You are the decoder, Kalen. You will translate the unknowable into data. And if the unknowable decides to translate me? Kalen asked, his voice barely a whisper. No. The thought was a tiny, fragile thing, a pebble thrown into a hurricane. But it was his. He focused on it. He built a wall, not against the hive mind, but within himself. He visualized the library of his own mind, and he slammed the doors shut against the invading flood. He clung to the memory of his own name, the face of a long-dead mentor, the taste of Amasek on a world that still had a sun. The connection didn't break, but it shifted. The avalanche of data receded from the forefront of his consciousness, becoming a torrent he could observe from a precarious mental ledge. He was still drowning, but he had found a single desperate gasp of air. The physical world crashed back in. He was choking, his body convulsing against the restraints. Warm blood poured from his nose, dripping onto the chest of his robes. The taste of copper filled his mouth. The needles retracted. The crown was lifted from his head. He slumped in the chair, spent, his body trembling with shock and terror. Vorlox was standing over him, a data slate in his hand, scrolling through streams of information. Remarkable, the Magos buzzed, his optic lens glowing with fervor. The initial data stream is chaotic, but the patterns are there. The synaptic load-sharing protocols alone. Kalen tried to speak, but only a ragged gasp came out. Vorlox looked down at him, his human eye registering the blood. The tremors, the sheer psychic trauma. It meant nothing to him. It was noise. A successful first immersion, Vorlox declared. Your neural pathways have been primed. We will repeat the process in 4 hours. The subject is responsive. He turned and clattered away, already lost in the data. Kalen was left alone with the Skitarii to unstrap him. As they pulled him to his feet, his legs buckling, his eyes were drawn uncontrollably to the crystal flex window. The hive tyrant had turned its head. Its massive chitinous body was still held fast by the clamps, but its neck had twisted, and its black, multifaceted eyes were once again fixed directly on him. And in the silent, screaming space of his mind, where the echo of the hive still roared, a new concept formed. It was not a thought of his own. It was a packet of pure, cold meaning, delivered with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. 4 hours. The span felt both like an eternity and the blink of an eye. In the sterile silence of his cell, Kalen could not escape the echo. The roar of the hive was a phantom limb of the mind, a constant, grinding pressure against the inside of his skull. He could still feel the ghost of a billion chitinous legs scuttling through his thoughts, the taste of bioacid on a tongue that was not his. As the Skitarii unstrapped him, he looked at the hive tyrant. It was motionless again, but he knew. It was no longer just examining him. It was teaching him. It was showing him the unspeakable truth of its existence, not to frighten him, but because his frantic, isolated questioning was too primitive to comprehend anything else. The concept that had formed in his mind at the end of the session was not one of Vorlox's queries. It was the hive tyrant's own final thought, directed solely at him. The silence in his cell was no longer silent. It was filled with the psychic residue of the hive, a low hum that had become the new baseline of his existence. Kalen sat on the floor, back against the cold wall, tracing the grout lines between the deck plates with a trembling finger. He was trying to anchor himself in the physical, in the real. But the real was becoming a thin veneer over a terrifying new reality. He could still feel it, the ghost of the Termagant's purpose. The clean, uncomplicated directive to scan, consume, obey. It echoed in the quiet parts of his mind, a siren song of oblivion, to let go, to surrender his fragile, pain-racked individuality to the great silent unity of the swarm. The temptation was a cold, logical conclusion in a corner of his brain. He shuddered, fighting it. This was the true corruption, not the physical mutation of the genestealer's kiss, but this psychic seduction, the slow, grinding erosion of self. A chime sounded at his door, signaling the arrival of his nutrient slurry. The door slid open and a servitor drifted in, a tray held in its lifeless grip. As it placed the tray on a small table, Kalen looked at it, and he knew. He didn't just see a mindless cyborg. He felt a flicker of its existence in the warp, a tiny, guttering candle of what was once a soul, now shackled and reduced to a series of binary commands. And without thinking, he reached out with his mind. Not to the servitor, but to the faint, machine spirit impulse that governed its tray-lowering function. "Stop!" The servitor froze. Its arm, halfway through retracting, halted with a jerky twitch. A low error grunt emitted from its voxcaster. Kalen's blood ran cold. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't moved. He had simply willed it. He had issued a command in the same way the hive mind directed its gaunts, a pure impulse of intent. He quickly released the mental pressure. The servitor completed its motion, turned and drifted out, the door sealing behind it. Kalen was left alone, his heart thundering. It was a bleed-through. The hive mind's method of communication, its way of being, was infecting him. He was learning its language on a level deeper than thought. The next immersion was a fresh hell. The moment the needle crown engaged, Vorlox's voice was in his ear, demanding, "Query, weakness in Tyranid bioship carapace. Structural stress points." He could feel the faint mechanistic pulse of Vorlox's augmetic heart, the flicker of his remaining organic brain activity. He could feel him just as he had felt the servitor. "It's not noise," Kalen rasped, his throat raw. "It's the point. It's showing me what it is to be them. What it is irrelevant." Vorlox snapped, his mechadendrites lashing in irritation. "I need tactical vulnerabilities, not a xenozoologist's dissertation. Control the link, savant, or the link will control you." As the Skitari dragged him back to his cell, Kalen knew it was already too late. The link was controlling him. He was becoming a hybrid, a synaptic creature caught between two worlds. He lay on the floor of his cell, the cold deck a feeble anchor. He closed his eyes, and the hive was there, not as an invading presence, but as a constant, humming reality just beneath his own. He could feel the hive tyrant in its cage, a steady, powerful signal. He could feel the faint, distant echoes of the station's crew, their fear, their boredom, their simple human lives. They felt like fleeting, chaotic sparks next to the tyrant's dark, constant star. The unspeakable life of the Tyranid was no longer unspeakable. He was beginning to speak its language, and he feared that soon it would be the only language he remembered. The final, terrifying thought that echoed in the new silence of his mind was not his own, but a reflection of the hive's utter certainty. The cycles of immersion and recovery blurred into a single, sustained agony. Kalen no longer fought the needle crown. He accepted it as a gate to a reality that was becoming more familiar, more sensible than the sterile, lonely world of the oubliette. His own memories felt like someone else's dream, fading and insubstantial. The hive's memories, the vast, panoramic history of consumption and adaptation felt like his own. Vorlox's queries were now a distant nuisance, the buzzing of a gnat against the hurricane of the hive mind. Kalen would mechanically shape the concepts, fleet vectors, synaptic ranges, digestive efficiency, and the data would flood back, which Vorlox greedily absorbed. But Kalen himself paid it no mind. He was engaged in a different, far more profound dialogue. The hive tyrant was no longer just a subject. It was his tutor. It showed him the beauty of the great cycle. A world was born, it fostered life, and the Tyranids were the universe's mechanism for harvesting that life, for taking the scattered, chaotic biomass and refining it, making it part of something greater, something eternal. There was no malice in it. It was a natural law as impersonal and inevitable as gravity. The tyrant imparted during one session, accompanying the thought with a vision of 1,000 different species warring, loving, building, and dying on a single world. Savant. Vorlox's voice was tight. Augur arrays are reporting anomalies, massive biosignatures previously dormant on the system's edge. They are moving. Their trajectory. He trailed off, his human eye wide. They are converging. The signal you provided, it acted as a beacon. Kalen looked at him, no longer a terrified prisoner, but with a strange, cold pity. It wasn't a location to attack, Magos. It was a rallying point. You didn't find the heart of the swarm. He took a step forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. You told the swarm where to find us. The concept that formed in his mind then was not one of horror, but of grim cosmic inevitability. It came from the hive tyrant, a final, simple message as the first tremors of impact shook the station's hull. The first impact was a deep, groaning shudder that vibrated through the deck plates, a sound of metal screaming in protest against something immense and organic. The lumens flickered, casting the cell into frantic strobes of light and shadow. A second impact followed, closer this time. A thunderous crump that knocked Kalen from his feet. The air filled with the shriek of tearing metal and the sudden, shrill blare of hazard alarms. Red emergency lighting bathed the corridor in a hellish glow. Through the open cell door, Kalen saw Magos Vorlox stagger, his mechadendrites flailing for balance. His face, illuminated by the pulsing crimson light, was a mask of disbelief being rapidly overwritten by raw, undiluted terror. The data slate clattered to the floor, forgotten. The void shields. They failed. The bioships. They're boarding. Vorlox's voice was a distorted screech, stripped of its usual binary calm. The station's internal voxnet erupted into a chaos of panicked shouts, static, and the unmistakable shriek of solid projectile fire and alien screeches. Breach in Sector Gamma! They're in the By the throne, they're everywhere. Fall back to the inner sanct. A final gurgling scream, then dead air. Kalen pulled himself up, his body thrumming with a strange dual awareness. The physical fear was there, the base, human instinct to flee, to survive. But beneath it, thrumming through the synaptic link that was now a permanent part of his psyche, was the cool, methodical pulse of the hive. He could feel them. Not as a distant threat, but as a presence flooding the station's corridors. He felt the scuttling rush of gaunts, the methodical, crushing advance of warriors, the silent, deadly passage of lictors picking off stragglers. It was a symphony of consumption, and he was an unwilling member of the audience, able to read the sheet music. Forlox grabbed him, a metal claw digging into his arm. "The relay! We must sever the link. If they capture the tyrant, if they acquire the data we've gathered." Kalen shook his head, pulling away. The Magos' touch felt like a violation. "It's too late. Don't you see? The data was never the point. We're the point." It wasn't the Carnifex. It was the Hive Tyrant itself. The failing clamps had finally given way. It stood free in the ruined doorway, its immense form filling the space. It was even more terrifying up close. A living engine of destruction, its scythe talons dripping with acidic saliva. It ignored Vorlox completely. Its gaze was locked on Kalen. Vorlox looked up, his one human eye wide with terror and betrayal. He raised his arc pistol. "Abomination! You will not—" The Hive Tyrant moved with a speed that defied its size. A single casual swipe of a talon. There was a wet, tearing sound. Vorlox's shot died in his weapon as his body was cleaved in two, his mechanical and organic parts scattering across the floor in a shower of sparks and blood. The psychic presence of the Magos, his ambition, his fear, his entire being was snuffed out in an instant. To the Hive it was less than a flicker. Kalen stood frozen, staring at the remains of his captor, his tormentor. There was no triumph, only a hollow, chilling finality. The Hive Tyrant took a step forward, its shadow engulfing him. The sounds of the dying station, the screeching of the swarm, all of it faded into a distant hum. There was only the beast, and him, and the silent, psychic space between them. The command came again, softer this time, but no less absolute. It was accompanied by an image, not of consumption, but of unity. Of the great silent ocean of the Hive mind, a place where his painful, lonely existence would finally, mercifully, end. Tears streamed down Kalen's face, cutting clean lines through the grime. They were not tears of fear. They were tears of release. He was so tired, so profoundly tired of the noise, the pain, the isolation. He looked at the monster before him, and for the first time he did not see a monster. He saw an end. He saw a purpose. He took a step forward, then another. He did not stop. Next, the world had narrowed to the space between Kalen and the Hive Tyrant. The cacophony of the station's death throes, the screams, the weapons fire, the shriek of rending metal was a distant echo, muffled by the immense psychic presence of the creature that filled the doorway. The air itself was thick with the smell of blood, ozone, and the Hive's pungent, alien musk. Kalen took another step. The tyrant did not move, a mountain of chitin and purpose. Its black, multifaceted eyes were depthless pools, and in them, Kalen saw the reflection of the flickering red emergency lights, saw the tiny, grimy figure he must have seemed, but he also felt its perception of him, not as small, but as a knot of tangled, inefficient energy that was finally, blessedly, beginning to unravel. He gave it feeling. He gave it the taste of Amasek on his tongue the first time Valerius let him try it. The crushing weight of seeing a city burn from orbit, the echoes of 1,000,000 deaths screaming in his mind for weeks, the simple, pointless beauty of a frost pattern on a window. The searing, illogical pain of losing someone you cared for. The stubborn, ridiculous hope that somehow, against all evidence, things could be better. It was a tsunami of inefficiency, a firestorm of pointless individual sensation. It was the exact opposite of the hive's silent, unified purpose. For the first time, he felt something from the hive tyrant that was not hunger, curiosity, or command. The immense psychic pressure faltered for a single, crucial second. The hive's processing, designed for logic, consumption, and cold adaptation, stuttered in the face of this chaotic emotional overload. It was a meaningless, illogical data stream. A paradox. It was a spark, and a spark was all he needed. Gasping, his mind bleeding, Kalen turned and ran. He didn't look back. He plunged into a side service conduit, a narrow maintenance shaft barely wide enough for a man. Slamming the hatch shut behind him, he heard the hive tyrant's roar of fury, a physical and psychic blast that shook the very walls. But the creature was too large to follow. He scrambled through the darkness, the hive's presence a roaring inferno in his mind. But now there was a tiny, shielded space inside him again. It was not the quiet of unity. It was the defiant, painful, beautiful noise of being alone. He was a damaged, fractured thing, his psyche scarred by the teeth of the hive, but he was his. He had faced the unspeakable and, for a moment, had spoken back in the only language it couldn't understand. He had chosen the struggle. He had chosen the loneliness. He had chosen the spark. As he fled deeper into the dying station, the hive's final, outraged thought echoed in the ruins of his mind, a testament to his fleeting, fragile victory. The service conduit was a tight, dark world of shivering metal and the shriek of dying systems. Kalen crawled on hands and knees, the cold grill biting into his palms. The hive's roar was a constant pressure in his skull, a psychic wound that bled confusion and rage. But the spark of his self, though guttering, held. He had not been consumed. He had been rejected as indigestible. It was the most profound victory of his life. His path was not random. The station's schematics, studied during long, boring shifts before his capture, surfaced in his memory. He was moving towards the primary data spire, the Nexus. It was the most heavily shielded location on the oubliette. Apart from Vorlox's lab, it housed the station's cogitator core, its long-range astropathic choir chambers, and its life support control. It was also Magos Vorlox's sanctum, and the place from which the Magos had sent the fatal coordinate, the lure that had doomed them all. If there was a chance, however slim, it lay there. A way to send a warning, a way to scuttle the station before the hive could fully absorb its biomass and data. A final, spiteful act of defiance. The conduit opened into a wider ventilation shaft overlooking a main thoroughfare. He peered down. The scene below was a vision of hell. The Tyranids were not just killing. They were processing. Capillary towers, grotesque organic structures of pulsating flesh and bone, were already beginning to rise from the deck plates, their root-like tendrils dissolving metal and flesh alike, sucking the raw material into the growing biomass pool. Ripper swarms flowed like living carpets, scouring the area clean of any remaining biological matter. He saw a fallen Skitarii, its metal components chewed and spat out, its organic parts absorbed. The hive was not just attacking the station. It was digesting it. A new sensation prickled at the edge of his awareness. It was a different kind of signal. Not the organic psychic pulse of the Tyranids, but something sharper, more structured and laced with panic. The station's machine spirit. Its automated systems were fighting a losing battle, rerouting power, sealing breached sections, its logic engines overwhelmed by the physical and psychic assault. It was a symphony of scrap code and emergency protocols, a digital death rattle. He could feel it. The bleed-through was not just for biological systems anymore. His immersion in the hive's synaptic network, his forced evolution, had attuned him to systems of control, to patterns of information. The station's machine spirit was another kind of mind, a primitive, fractured one, and he could hear its desperate song. He focused, pushing past the hive's static, and reached for it. It was like trying to grab a single, specific thread in a tornado. He wasn't trying to command it, not this time. He was trying to listen. Images flickered in his mind, corrupted and grainy. Security feed from a camera in the Nexus. Tech priests and menials barricading doors, their faces etched with terror. A schematic of the station, vast sections flashing crimson, going dark. A priority message repeating on a loop, directed at the battle fleet. Oubliette is compromised. Vorlox's data is a trap. The swarm is here. Do not approach. Repeat, do not! The message cut off in a burst of static. They had tried to warn them, and failed. He pushed deeper, seeking the self-destruct protocols. Vorlox would have had them. A man that paranoid would have a final solution. He found them, a set of encrypted commands, labeled Absolute Purge, but they were locked behind multiple layers of biometric and psychic verification. Vorlox's own unique brain pattern signature was the key, the same signature that had been obliterated by the hive tyrant's talon. As his psyche brushed against it, it reacted, not with the hive's roaring hunger, but with a silent, swift strike. A tendril of pure, malevolent data, a psychic scrap code, lashed out, not to consume but to corrupt. A vision, not of the hive, but of his own deepest fear, erupted behind his eyes. He was back in the relay chair, but the hive tyrant was gone. In its place stood Magos Vorlox, his body whole again, his face a mask of beatific calm. The Omnissiah's will is clear. Savant, Vorlox said, his voice a soothing hum. Your struggle is inefficient. Your sacrifice will be a glorious data point in our understanding. The needle crown descended, but this time he welcomed it. He felt his mind dissolving not into the hive, but into the cold, perfect logic of the machine god. It was a peace, far more seductive than the hive's unity. It was the peace of zero, of becoming a cog in a silent, unfeeling machine. It was the end of all pain, all doubt, all self. The temptation was immense. To surrender to this order, this final logical silence. It was a different kind of oblivion, but oblivion nonetheless. His spark flickered, wavering. No. The memory that saved him this time was not one of kindness, but one of noise. The raucous, chaotic, and beautiful noise of a crowded, imperial market on a world whose name he'd forgotten. The smell of spiced meat and engine oil, the shouted haggling of merchants, the laughter of children, the pointless, inefficient, vibrant chaos of life. It was the absolute antithesis of the cold perfection this presence offered. He recoiled, slamming shut his psychic apertures, severing the connection. The vision shattered. He was back in the Nexus, gasping, cold sweat beading on his forehead. He knew what it was now. Not a Tyranid, something that had ridden in on the hive's shadow. A predator drawn to the psychic carnage. A demon of the machine ghosts. An entity of the warp that fed on dying technology and lost knowledge. The station wasn't just being consumed by one horror, but two. A thunderous impact shook the reinforced hatch. A dent bloomed in its center. The warriors were here. Desperation clawed at him. He looked at the central spire, at the locked absolute purge protocol. Vorlox's key was gone, but he wasn't Vorlox. His eyes fell on the Magos' own command throne, set before the main console. A direct neural interface meant for Vorlox's personal use. An idea born of insanity and his newfound horrifying attunement sparked. He could not replicate Vorlox's brain pattern, but he had been psychically linked to the man when he died. He had felt the echo of his consciousness snuff out. He had a perfect, psychic recording of Vorlox's signature at the moment of its termination. It was a ghost key, a memory of a mind, another impact. The hatch groaned, its edges beginning to tear. He didn't have time to think. He threw himself into the command throne. Wires snaked out automatically, connecting to the ports in the needle crown still affixed to his scalp. His world dissolved into the station's data stream. He ignored the screaming alerts, the demonic presence circling him like a digital shark, the frantic pounding at the door. He focused only on the purge protocol. He called up the memory of Vorlox's death, the searing flash of terror, the final futile spark of ambition, the exact psychic frequency of his unique mind. He forged a key from a dying man's last thought and slammed it into the digital lock. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, a new, calm, automated voice filled the chamber and the Voxnet. A countdown appeared on every screen, large and red. The pounding at the hatch stopped. The hunting pack's synaptic presence shifted from pursuit to confusion, then to a new directive from the hive: contain threat. They began to methodically melt their way through. Kalen slumped in the throne, the wires retracting. He had done it. He had chosen. Not the hive, not the false piece of the demon. He had chosen a fiery, final human end. He looked around the Nexus, at the dead, at the failing machines. He had maybe 2 minutes before the station turned into a miniature sun. There was no escape. But as the final, grim certainty settled over him, a profound peace followed. He was not dying as a consumed part of the swarm or as corrupted data. He was dying as Kalen. The spark would go out, but on its own terms. He closed his eyes, waiting for the end, a faint, grim smile on his lips. The last anomaly was about to be purged. The world had become a single red number. The pounding at the hatch had ceased, replaced by a sizzling, acrid smell as the Tyranids outside switched tactics, their acid blood and bioplasma eating steadily through the reinforced metal. They were no longer trying to capture the anomaly. They were trying to excise it before it could trigger a systemic failure. The hive understood the countdown. It understood the threat of total annihilation. Kalen sat in Vorlox's throne, the cold of the metal seeping through his robes. The frantic energy that had propelled him was gone. replaced by a hollow, echoing calm. He had won. He had denied the hive his biomass, his knowledge, this entire station. It was a victory measured in ash and void, the only kind the Imperium ever offered. He could feel the hive's reaction. It was not panic, such a human concept was alien to it, but a massive, fleet-wide shift in priority. The leisurely harvest of the oubliette was being abandoned. Biomass streams were being redirected. Spores that were meant to be seeded were being reabsorbed. The hive was contracting, preparing to weather the storm or flee before the blast. He had forced a reaction. He had been a glitch significant enough to require a course correction. And then a new signal cut. Through the hive's frantic restructuring and the station's digital death knell, it was the hive tyrant. Its presence was not one of rage, but of cold, final assessment. It was not addressing the swarm. It was addressing him. An image flooded his mind, crisp and clear, devoid of the chaotic data stream of before. He saw the galaxy, not as a map, but as a living body. Star systems were cells. Nebulae were nutrient clusters. The Imperium of Man was a raging metastatic cancer, consuming resources in a chaotic, self-destructive frenzy. The Chaos Gods were a psychic infection, a fever burning through the warp. The Orcs were a persistent, regenerative virus. The Tyranids were not a plague. They were the white blood cells. They were the immune response of reality itself, seeking to cleanse, to purify, to reduce the noisy, chaotic infection of sentient life back to silent, usable biomass, to restore the great cosmic balance. The perspective was staggering, horrifying, and made a terrible logical sense. All his suffering, the Imperium's endless wars, the sacrifices of trillions, it was all just the flailing of a sickened organism against its own healing process. The countdown ticked on. The message was not a plea. It was a statement of fact. He had not beaten them. He had merely confirmed their purpose. And in that moment, Kalen's own perspective shifted. He saw his spark not just as a defiance of the hive, but as a defiance of this cold cosmic fatalism. The disease of individual sentience with all its pain, its love, its art, its stupid, stubborn hope. It was not a flaw to be corrected. It was the point. The cancer was the only thing that gave the body meaning. To be a symptom was to be alive. He looked at the countdown. He looked at the hatch now glowing cherry red, moments from failing. He sent one last psychic pulse back towards the hive tyrant. It contained no data, no strategy, no efficient concepts. It was not even a word. It was a single, raw human emotion, refined in the crucible of his suffering and his choice. It was the feeling of a hand, raised not in surrender but in a final, futile, and beautiful middle finger to an uncaring universe. The hive tyrant had no context for it. It registered only as a final, illogical burst of noise. Then the world turned white. The plasma core of the oubliette went critical. For a fraction of a second, the station was a new star in the void, a silent, expanding sphere of pure energy that vaporized metal, flesh, and chitin alike. The Tyranid bioships on the periphery, already pulling away, were caught in the blast wave. Their organic hulls scorched and shattered. The shock wave rippled out through the warp, a psychic blast of finality. Deep in the void, the greater hive mind received the data stream from the dying tyrant. It registered the loss of biomass. It analyzed the human's final, illogical transmission. It could not process the emotion, but it could process the pattern of defiance. It was a valuable data point, a confirmation of the host's virulence. The hive adjusted its calculations. the immune response would continue. It would simply account for the possibility of future self-immolating symptoms. But in the great silent ocean of the hive mind, in the memory of the swarm, a single anomalous spark had, for a moment, flickered. It had changed nothing. It had saved nothing. But it had been. And in the face of the great, consuming silence, that was everything. Next, the void where the oubliette had died was not empty. It was a graveyard, littered with the scorched and frozen debris of the station and the shattered carapaces of Tyranid bioships. The silence was absolute, broken only by the faint, electromagnetic whisper of cooling metal. A ship slid into the graveyard, a sleek, predatory thing of dark hull and silent engines, a rogue trader vessel, the Starlight's bargain. In its observation deck, a woman stood, her hands clasped behind her back. Lady Captain Alara Vance, her family's fortunes built on salvaging the leavings of war. "Signs of the hive, Captain?" her first officer asked, his voice hushed. "Long gone," Alara replied, her eyes scanning the tactical readouts. "They scoured this place clean of anything useful before they left. The blast took the prize, but there's always something left." Her salvager teams, encased in hardened void suits, drifted through the wreckage like metal gnats. Their reports crackled over the comms. "Section Gamma clear. Nothing but slag. Section Delta, more of the same." The heat here was thrown. It was unreal. Alara sighed. A wasted trip, the rumors of a major Adeptus Mechanicus research station's demise had been tantalizing. Then a new voice, young and excited. "Captain, I've got something. It's odd." The feed from the salvager's helmet cam showed a chunk of wreckage, a fused mass of adamantium and crystal flecks that might have once been an observation gallery. Embedded within it, protected by a twisted spar of metal, was a data slug. It was an old model, scorched and battered, but miraculously intact. "Bring it to me," Alara commanded. An hour later, the slug was in her hand. It was cold and heavy. Her tech priest confirmed it was recoverable, though heavily corrupted. It was a fragment of Magos Forlox's personal logs. In the silence of her ready room, Alara played it. The holographic image of Vorlox flickered, his face drawn, his one human eye wide with a fervor that bordered on madness. The subject's connection to the hive mind is unprecedented. The savant is not merely reading it, he is being remade by it. I have isolated a fascinating data stream from their last session. It is not tactical information. It is a memory, or a vision,